for making it here. Alright, on opening government, we have Carlton, opening opposition Hybrid, closing government Western, and closing opposition Julia. Queen, sorry. My bad. Alright, so without any further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open a case for us. Here.
Madam Speaker, a week ago, the law students at Harvard Law School woke up to find black pieces of tape covering all the pictures of black professors at Harvard Law School. If you are to go by the news reporting that was done in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New York Post, and every other major news source in the United States, you would find that the overwhelming sentiment and the overwhelming portrayal of that event was that this was definitely an event of racial aggression against black professors. The issue there, though, is that we actually have no way of knowing that. We have no idea who did it, why they did it, whether or not it was to talk about the fact that black professors are hugely a minority at that law school, or whether or not their protest is actually a racial aggression. But there's no way to actually parse out or figure any of those things out, because the media has taken a stance on what that must mean, and as a result, radicalized that issue. That completely cedes the power of black students at Harvard itself to come to any conclusion or come to any true discourse of how they choose to portray and engage with that issue. Very simple model that Cam and I give you. In status quo, private and universities decide themselves when to allow or bar media from campus. We think that they should stop doing that. They should not decide for themselves, but rather err on the side of student sentiment. Student sentiment that can be generated in a number of different mechanisms, be it a referenda, be it a voted body of student leaders, etc. I think there's a host of mechanisms that students can choose to employ themselves and decide on. 4 arguments I want to talk to you about in this speech. Firstly, why private universities have a principal obligation to their students, because Cam and I would tell you that their students are the principal stakeholders and owners of that university. Secondly, on why minority students are often the most discriminated against and need this power. Thirdly, on why the 24-hour news cycle is terrible and why it radicalizes issues beyond any recognition and why that's harmful. And lastly, on why media portrayal of universities is harmful and why specialized schools especially are targeted as a result and need this protection. Firstly, on private universities having an obligation to their students, first off. In a very simple principle statement, Madam Speaker, I would tell you that students at an institution where they pay the tuition and generate the vast proportion of wealth required to run that establishment as opposed to public institutions that are funded by the state, that those students have primary ownership of the land and of the spaces of protest that exist on that university. Sure, administrations may have the authority to facilitate how education is conducted, but the primary owners of that space are students. And as a result, they should have the ability to choose when or not media individuals are allowed onto that campus, in the very same way that individuals are allowed to choose when media is allowed into their own home and allowed to portray or discuss their lives and report on the things happening in their own home. But additionally, 3 warrants here. First off, that most of all, students are disproportionately affected, or student protests are disproportionately affected by media reporting. It is not such that these are additional to that any exposure to or reporting about misconducts of the administration or etc. can be exposed by the will of students wanting to report those things to the university, to the press themselves. The issue, though, is that on issues that students want to have facilitated campus dialogue between their own students, to not allow themselves so that they can feel safe in the fact that students aren't being discriminated against, students aren't being targeted or vilified in the media as a whole. They need and have the principal right to defend and limit the access of prying eyes onto that campus and onto that protest in the first place. Second thing I want to talk to you about, the private institutions are different as a result of the funding mechanisms that generate the rights and properties of that land that I explained to you. Secondly, minority students and why they are disproportionately affected by issues on these campuses. Because make no mistake, The large issues that are being contended with and are coming forth, either at UMass, at Baylor, at Harvard, what have you, disproportionately affect minorities on campus. People who have a disproportional lack of access to the structures of power that exist in society as a whole. They disproportionately lack the ability to control the views of the new media that are portrayed upon them. To disproportionately counter narratives such as all black people are violent because they listen to black music and engage in drugs and drug trade, etc. For those minority groups, most specifically, this power is the most important. Why? Because for them to feel like they have a place on that campus that isn't under constant scrutiny, they have to have the ability to limit the ways in which the media vilifies them and projects them. The only way you get any solve to that can never occur on side opposition, because they're never meant to feel as if they have control over that space. We uniquely afford them that control when you give the power, put the power in their hands. Yeah, sure, Megan.
Okay, so assuming the media, if it's a good enough story, will still cover it. How much worse is that story when you can't go onto the campus, get any real coverage, talk to anyone?
Okay, so first up, I'm going to explain that more in my final point, but this is my third argument, why the media coverage is always almost bad. Why? First, let's talk about the incentives of the 24-hour news cycle. Firstly, media presence on campus in and of itself causes massive disruption, insofar as students are deterred from going to classes, insofar as it causes a massive parade on campus that makes people feel genuinely unsafe or unwilling to engage in the campus atmosphere in the first place. As a result, it gets less involvement and less students coming out to join the protest in the first place. Insofar as those protests are meant to change policies on campus, see the invasion of Brandeis students of buildings on that campus to protest the racial makeup of students on that campus, we think that that is a great model to follow. Why? Because those students at Brandeis, one, were respected by Brandeis security for not allowing media on campus. But secondly, it meant that those protesters could generate their own media, could choose when they wanted to give interviews to specific reporters who they know would be fair, would actually portray those issues well in the media, and they could start a social media platform where they were able to discuss their own views. Moreover, the 24-hour news cycle is actually particularly pernicious in that it tries to find a story that is going to get the most views overall. This means that they radicalize issues, that they make the actions on Harvard, they need them to be racist, and they put that portrayal in society because that generates more clicks, that generates more access to media in and of themselves, given that they're motivated by profit, and as a result, they radicalize the issue in and of itself. That means that the very people on campus who are most affected are least able to access them because they entirely do not understand or entirely are diverse from the views that are portrayed in the media in and of itself. Madam Speaker, I think that the greatest power we can afford to people who are persecuted on campus is to allow them to choose how their issues are portrayed in the media. We're very proud to propose.
Great. Thank the Prime Minister for that speech and call for the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Mo tells you at the top of his speech that this disproportionately hurts minorities on campuses when the media can craft their stories for them. What about campuses where you are the minority of that campus? And your question of what is most important to you and the question of whether or not you have the right to make your protest a public action is in the hands of the majority of your campus. I would point to Harvard University as my first example. Look at the population of Harvard University, maybe not from CUSID, but in the majority of circumstances, you're talking about a bunch of white, very privileged people who have paid a lot of money for a fancy degree and really don't want that to be attached to a name like Harvard hates black people, right? So in the circumstance that you are somebody who has an interest in making sure your school seems as prestigious as possible, you are never going to vote to allow that protest to become public knowledge, and you are never going to allow the opinion of the university and the opinion of the people who go to that university to be soiled by the protests that happen around it. I think that this is bad for free speech. I think this is bad for learning about university campuses. And I think that institutions like we're talking about, like Harvard, like Yale, they influence a lot in the countries where they come from, and I don't think it's fair to let them do this. I want to talk to you about a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about the role of education. Then I'm going to talk about the media perceptions, what happens when you have poor schools labeled one way and rich schools labeled another way. I'm going to talk about non-student protests, why we think that they need to be able to happen at campuses. And then I'm going to talk about media incentives before I refute everything that's said on their side of the house. Let's talk about the role of education, because Aizen and I see it as an agent of socialization into the sphere. So what happens when media doesn't cover protests that happen at those schools? First, I think that they make it generally worse for students not to be able to mimic the actual conditions of the societies that they're going to enter after they leave those schools in the first place. So artificially insulating your students from being able to be criticized by media is probably a bad standard for schools that are supposed to set you up for a good life to actually take. But I think that the media perceptions that come along with these are really bad too. Because when you have state schools who are generally have lower tuition and more like socioeconomically less well-off people end up going to those institutions, you get a really bad perception of them. Because when they happen on public land, you see that these are the schools with the problems. You get pigeonholed into thinking that people from those socioeconomic classes, the people who can afford to go to those schools, have all these protests. What's going on there? Why are they being animals compared to all these other private institutions who end up benefiting falsely from the idea that there are no problems on their campuses? So I think that is a terrible narrative to do there. So places like Harvard and Yale become further insulated as the beacons of education in society and end up getting a reputation that they don't deserve. Well, let's talk about non-student protests, because I think this is a really good point in the debate. So if you are being shut down constantly from having media be able to enter your campus, you also can't draw on those centers of education to be the places where you can host non-student protests, or at least have them joined in. Take a look at the University of Cape Town. I think it's extremely important that at the University of Cape Town, you had other South Africans being able to come and protest the Cecil Rhodes statue, right? So in the circumstance that you shut out those protests, you speak on behalf of not only the people who go to that school who have an interest, but all of South Africans who think that that was a terrible statue to have on that university in the first place. So having less free media that can happen on campuses is in general a bad thing, Aislinn and I would say on our side of the house. Go ahead, Mo.
If it was important for the students at the University of Cape Town that they spread that message, our model allows them to do that and allows them to invite protests anyway. What is your argument?
Okay, but if you want to, okay, so if you go into the referendum and assuming then you start giving interviews on a private basis and you guys didn't vote on that, then you would be harming that referendum. So all of the principles that you stand on about having this like you can't speak on behalf of all the other students. I assume there would be some sort of recourse for you if you went over the terms of the referendum to do that, right, in that circumstance. So if you have to agree on who can give the interview and stuff, you also cut out minority voices by not allowing everybody to be able to give their opinion on that. That's what you get when you have free press on campuses like we want. So in circumstances like that. So what don't you know now in these schools? Think about, for example, a pro-life protest. In university campuses, that's super unlikely to get voted in the referendum to have that pro-life protest actually be covered by the media. Why? Because you want your university to look like a liberal institution in the first place, or other people would feel like that's wrong. I think it's really terrible for the people who are pro-life not to have the actual access to media based on the opinions of their campuses. In the same way, if you were on a very conservative campus, you wouldn't have these rights either, and I think that's a pretty terrible incentive to work with. Let's talk about how media incentives work in this case too. Because if you permanently lose access to these institutions, or on a pretty constant basis, you know you're not going to be able to enter onto places like Harvard or Yale, you then, as media, don't even bother trying to get those interviews from people because you know it's not profitable to sink your time or resources into sort of pursuing those means. Instead, what you do is exactly what we fear coming from Mo's model, where you just report on those issues from outside the school and from outside speculation from forces who obviously aren't that invested in the protest because they're not voting in that referendum, or they're not even aware that the referendum is going on, or about the wishes of those schools. So I think that you get a worse circumstance on that side of the house. What does Mo talk to you about in his speech? So first of all, he tells you about the issue of the black professors, and actually I'll take you. Go ahead.
Okay, but your characterization relies on the worst possible actual version of the model, wherein every student votes. But Mo specifically said that the protesters themselves have these votes, so you wouldn't have pro-life protests just going away. That makes no sense.
Only the people who are allowed to protest get to vote. Then how does that shape the narrative of your school properly, right? And how do you, if you have vested interest in not doing that, couldn't you just say, I am one of the protesters, right? There's no mechanism to be I am or I'm not one of the protesters. And also, limiting access to protest in the first place is a real shit thing to do to people too. To be well, if you didn't sign up for it, you're not allowed to fucking protest. That doesn't make any sense. Okay, so also, on this idea, so on the black professors idea, Mo's we have to read into it to assume that everybody hates these black professors at Harvard Law. What if they do, right? And at the circumstance, in the case that you can't actually interview anybody in the Harvard Law Department because the students at Harvard University decided that they wanted to place a media ban on that, I think it really silences the voices of those professors who could be combating institutional racism, and you've now put a blockade on them being able to express themselves. So what a terrible example. It's not even students being hurt in that case. It's actual legal professors who may want to actually show that at the top of their academic field, at Harvard University, they're not able to talk about their ideas. I think that's bad. Then he says that students pay tuition, so they have private ownership of that. I think, and you look at my pro-life example, and you get to silence dialogue, I don't think that students get to own the rights of small minority groups on campus that may have smaller, unpopular ideas, but still legitimate ones that I think that they have the ability to talk about. Then he said that protesters can now generate their own media and they get access at what time. But who are you putting at the top of this hierarchy of protesters, right? Because at the point where you have somebody who's leading this protest and who's speaking on behalf of everybody, then their ideas become paramount. When you have freedom of press on these university campuses, then you have the ability for every single person to air out what they want in media, and I think that you have to give them that right if you want to have free and open dialogue. For all these reasons, we proudly oppose.
I thank the speaker for the speech and now call upon our Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
To be clear, at the top of my speech here today, Honourable Speaker, it's the protest groups themselves that make the call as to whether or not media are ultimately allowed onto those into those protest spaces in the first place. The point of our model is that there's a variety of ways in which student groups on campus make decisions. Some make them on the basis of an executive, some make them on the basis of consensus decision-making. We think insofar as those different mechanisms of decision-making exist, those groups themselves get to make the call through whatever means that they see fit within that. One additional argument in terms of how media portrays universities broadly and also specialized institutions and why we think that's problematic, then lots of reputation and rebuilding of the things we've heard out of this debate thus far. So the fourth argument on opening government is about media portrayal of universities broadly. First of all, I think there's a general perception of universities writ large within the media, particularly in the United States, that they are nests and hotbeds of radicalism, that they are nests of leftists and Marxists and all sorts of things that are viewed as being broadly problematic in American mainstream society. We think, given that, there are particular incentives in the media structures to confirm those biases. It means that when you go into protests at, say, a Yale, or at a Brandeis, or a Brigham Young, it means there's incentives on the part of media, not necessarily to create a cross-section of what protest groups to believe, but to find the particularly radical beliefs, to find the particularly extremist views that conform to those preconceived notions of what universities are and how university students think, and in doing so often misrepresent protests themselves and misrepresent the goals of those protests. There is no guarantee on opposition side of the House that engagement between protest groups and the media will occur through established channels that can actually create a codified average of what these groups want and what these groups are seeking, and we think it's very important to be able to do so and control the narrative that is shaped about them. But more importantly, I think that in many cases, private universities exist to serve particular niches, to specialize, to serve particular demographics, be that Brigham Young University in Utah serving particularly Mormon students, be that the original founding purpose of Brandeis University. I think that those specialized groups that have specialized institutions that exist are far more likely to become under attack from media themselves as being out of line with social norms and being out of line with the broader mainstream. I think it's therefore particularly important for those private specialized institutions to guarantee that their students can exist in a space wherein their identities and their views are not constantly under attack, are not constantly scrutinized by broader society, and are not constantly going to be misrepresented and mischaracterized by media that thrives on controversy, that thrives upon the existence of a story constantly within that circumstance. They should be able to exist in a safe space where they aren't constantly under attack. I think that the media has incentives to do so, given that those controversies can be created. Sure.
Just because you might not like the media coverage does not give you a good reason to infringe on their First Amendment rights to cover the story, and also I'm not sure why the media covers it better when they don't have direct access to the protest.
I think that when media has, the way in which media engage with protest is through the channels that protest groups themselves decide upon, and to the extent that protest groups themselves decide upon, it means that they actually can create the way in which they want to be presented to the broader public, the way in which they want their views to be represented. It means that the media can't just find the one particularly radical person in the protest sit-in and say that those views represent the entirety of the protest as it exists as a whole. What do we get out of Megan in this round? What are our responses to it? She tells you, first of all, the role of universities to exist as an agent of socialization, that students can't mimic the exposure of media in real life, and this is problematic. Okay. But universities also have obligations to ensure that their students can exist in an environment where they feel comfortable learning. And given the importance of universities to things like social mobility, given that in the modern era in the Western world, your ticket to the middle class is punched with a university degree, I think it's also extraordinarily important to ensure that those are spaces where students can feel comfortable, where they can feel that they are not going to be under constant pressure, scrutiny, and attack from outside forces. So I don't think it's purely about mimicking the aspects of real life. It's the same reason the universities often have speech codes that go above and beyond the restrictions that are placed on the hate speech. speech. Why they guarantee things like safe spaces for particular minorities within those universities. Because it's not simply about mimicking real life, it's about creating an environment where learning can occur, where an education can occur, and that often means that it's not necessarily conducive to have outside media be exposed to it constantly. They say that public universities are now going to be pigeonholed as problem universities. Like the reason that there's a distinction between public and private universities is because public universities have constitutional obligations to protect First Amendment lives because they're funded by the state. I think private universities have a unique obligations to their students, given that they only exist by the grace of their students, who pay tuition fees, who donate to them as alumni, and provide for the endowment funds that maintain universities like Harvard and Yale or Brandeis and Brigham Young. They are the reason these universities exist. They have a particular obligation to those students in the first place. Sure.
Just to be clear, the reason why you think that the students should have the choice is because they pay fees, but you're excluding a vast amount of students from voting in the referendum as to whether or not the media can come on campus?
So, I think that the reality, I think two things within this. First of all, I think that, given that in many cases student unions themselves and administrations themselves adjudicate whether protests can take place in the first place in universities, that's the check that exists within that. But I think secondly, I think at the point at which there are protests, those particular students deserve to have their views most represented and most heard at any given time. Obviously, it's not going to be the same groups at all circumstances at all times. I think it broadly balances out over the long run. They tell you, second of all, that you shut out outsiders from participating in broader protests. Okay. But at the point at which a protest at the University of Cape Town wants to have outside exposure and wants to have outside pressure, they're still perfectly allowed to do so and still perfectly reasonable to say, we want as much exposure as possible, we want as much media discussion as possible. The point is that in circumstances where student groups or student protesters don't want outside media exposure and don't want to have media constantly interacting with every single person within the city and being subject to constant scrutiny and pressure from them, it's perfectly legitimate for those groups to say, we do not desire this. I think student groups can make that calculus themselves as to what they ultimately want within that. Then they say that pro-life protests aren't going to happen as a result of this. This isn't about restricting the ability of students to protest in the first place. This is about how they choose to represent themselves. And I think actually that pro-life protests are more likely to occur at institutions to the point at which they are less likely to be misrepresented by a media that broadly tends to be more socially, trends more socially liberal than them, at say a specialist institution like Brigham Young or a Catholic university, what have you. They then tell you that the media doesn't bother getting interviews so they don't engage with outsiders. I think that the problem that exists within the way in which media interacts with student protests is that because of the nature of the 24-hour news cycle that Mo tells you about on our side of the house, there is a particular incentive to generate the most controversy and to generate the most clicks within that. It means there's an incentive to find the particularly radical protester and to misrepresent the views of those protests insofar as you have to constantly keep that story going. That creates perverse incentives for that media themselves. What does Mosif tell you in this round and why isn't it adequately responded to? He tells you, first of all, these universities have an obligation to their students by the grace of the fact that they exist because of the students' tuition fees, by the virtue of the fact that alumni donate to those universities in the first place. We get no meaningful response to this. We think that students ultimately ought to be given preference in terms of determining how they are represented on those private universities and those private institutions, in terms of how their protests are represented to the outside world themselves. We think it's particularly important to allow minority students who are disproportionately underrepresented and misrepresented within these campuses to control the way in which their narratives and their protests and their grievances are portrayed to the outside world. We think it's particularly important that private universities give them the ability to do this. Very, very proud to propose.
Great, thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that speech, and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Honourable Speaker, we agree that universities, and in particular private universities, or wherever you want to talk about, have a duty of care to the students that go to that school. The problem is, when you put how those people are treated in the hands of the majority or in the hands of a group that is really poorly defined by proposition, that necessarily impacts the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression of a lot of those individuals we think they have the duty of care to. It is our contention that completely free access of the media to all institutions of education is the best way to maximize the experience of all students that go to that university, regardless of where they're from. I'm going to add something new to this debate. I'm going to talk about the importance of space and reclamation of the institutions of those universities, why you necessarily move protests away from the centers that they are directly protesting, and why that is meaningfully impactful. And then I'm going to get into refutation of everything that we hear and the responses that they had to Megan. So first of all, what happens to these protests at the point at which they are no longer allowed to occur on that space if the referendum ends up passing and the media stops? I don't think that the strength of those protests are able to continue, because oftentimes the ability for a person to protest that particular institution requires outside support and legitimacy to be taken seriously by that university, to be taken seriously by other people who perhaps are also wanting to protest that, perhaps support from the public, perhaps support from people who are able to help them either financially or through the visibility. At that point, I think that they move away from those centers of education, away from that public space. Why is that uniquely bad? Because oftentimes the problem is not simply just the idea, but it is connecting that idea to areas of exclusion, to areas where they have felt that discrimination, be it a statue that happened or a building that they were excluded from attending in the first place. And I think that it is massively important that the only people they care about are the people who are enrolled at that school at that particular point in time. First of all, a lot of times they're not able to enroll at all, or perhaps they're not enrolled right now, but still feel the same kinds of problems from having that particular university act in a particular way. I think that this is an act of reclamation and should always be prioritized over the people who perhaps think that that media story is going to get it wrong. Why? Because I think that they are wrong about the media getting it wrong. Because I think that Megan is quite right when she tells you Mo's first example about the fact that we're not able to know exactly what happened with this protest means that the media is going to cover it to a certain extent. It's just probably going to be a shoddy job and paint that as a particularly unorganized protest. And I think that given that, the fact that I don't think that they are right about that particular complaint, it is wrong for us to exclude those individuals from having the most effective protest that's actually connected to the thing that they are being excluded from. But let's get into reputation, because I do want to deal with the issue of like who is protesting, who is voting in this referendum and whether or not that matters. It definitely matters, because if side proposition wants to tell us it's only going to be true protesters who are voting on this, and they're going to be the ones who end up deciding whether or not that space is open. The first thing, Megan does tell you, like, how do you determine whether or not you are a legitimate protester, or whether or not you just have an incentive to influence the outcome of that referendum? And they never really answer that question, and it matters because any practical realization of their policy depends on that being true and depends on those particular people happening. So I think that any person who has an incentive ends up, any person who has an incentive at that point is going to participate. But second, and importantly, what I added to you before, that I don't think that it's just the students who are enrolled right now should have a say or should have access to those particular people. It might be people who don't actually get to engage in that particular institution at all, and it is important for them to be able to protest that. Yep.
Okay, many of the protests that have used this public protection at public universities like the University of Missouri have been sexual assault incidents where small groups of people who are lobbying against their university do not want to share their identities with media and have their name attached to the fact that they're having a sexual assault dispute with the university and where they're dealing with it. Why should they have to attach their name to that to be valued as a person in these disputes?
First of all, I think that we have really robust areas in the media where we're able to redact names from the kinds of stories that we're talking about when it's sensitive information like sexual assault. But second of all, that is assuming that that very small group that you stipulated was very small was going to win that referendum, right? Like if you're a person who doesn't want that particular group to ever get the kinds of protections that they want, perhaps you think that they are wrong, you're probably not going to vote for that. Or you are going to talk to the media outside and say that this particular protest is necessarily bad. Like the same kinds of coverage that you're talking about necessarily happen. It's whether or not those groups ever end up being able to have it tied to that particular institution and that land and where that protest ends up happening. But second, let's deal with this idea about the incentives of the media. Because from CAM specifically, no thanks, we hear that the incentives of the media when this ban, or when the ban is not there, when they have free access, is that they're going to find the most extreme person and they're going to focus on that. That's interesting because I wonder what happens when they're not able to access a broad group of protesters. Who are the most likely to go to the media, to seek them out, to talk specifically about how big of a problem it is? It's the ones who care the most deeply about it, who, if you're talking about the most extreme, like they are definitely going to be heard. They're still going to tell that story. It's just that you don't have access to perhaps the array of people who would have wanted to participate in that protest because it's not happening in the places where they have to visibly end up dealing with that. Sure, go ahead.
Is Fox News' incentive in covering protests to accurately portray the grievances of those protesters or to shape reporting to their pre-existing political bias?
It might be to shape their reporting to their pre-existing political bias. That happens on your side, like I just said, but also I think it's important that other media sources are able to fight against each other. Like for every Fox News, there's another more liberal one, right? Like I think that just generally happens, and usually it solves for the kinds of stories that we're talking about, that you get a more roundabout view, but also you don't shut off Fox News from saying what they want about particular protests at a university. they just never have to contend with the actual lived experiences of the people who don't seek them out. I think that that's necessarily bad. So I think it's also important just to recognize that side proposition also does a terrible job at telling you why the people who pay student fees necessarily ought be the ones determining that. But even so, they exclude a massive amount of people who do pay student fees from ever voting in that referendum when they say it should only be the protesters, and they never provided a particular distinction. I don't think there is one, but I think that they did a bad job there. So then what I want to deal with lastly is the idea that fewer students join the protests, because that's what Mo told you from the beginning. He said that some students are going to feel unsafe and they're not going to go there. I mean, on both sides of the house, there are some students who won't want to participate in a protest because it is public to the media, and there are some who won't want to participate because it isn't. Given that, you have to weigh what the impacts on those particular individuals are. Do we care more about the people who would like to have their identity sealed, or the ones who necessarily need that protest to continue? And I think that we ought to care about the ones who continue more so, because those are the ones who are going to necessarily be impacted by that media's coverage in the first place. And I think that that's necessarily bad. So given the fact that both sides have a particular people, we think that the most effective type of protest is the one in which the media is able to access it. That the areas of education ought to be ones for social institution. And when you never have to deal with issues and protests at those spaces of learning, that undermines education. We beg to oppose.
Great. I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech, and now call upon a member of government. Here.
Madam Speaker, I think that different kinds of protests have different goals, and I don't think that the protections that universities can provide are necessarily going to apply, or the student leaders aren't going to want to have them apply in every case, right? It's going to be in specific kinds of protests in which it's going to be requested. I think if they thought that the media was necessary, like, they wouldn't be asking for these protections. Moreover, I contest the fact they talk about media being appropriate in all cases, right? I think that what media can do a lot of the time is increase a lot of tensions and polarizations, and as a result, make it a lot harder for student groups and universities to reach a resolution or any sort of median end. So what am I going to be doing for today? First of all, refuting what we hear so far from Aislinn and Megan, and then 2 points of extension for you, Madam Speaker. First of all, what protests are most impacted and what they're going to end up looking like. And second of all, how we're actually able to get better outcomes, because we don't actually hear that so far from our opening opposition. Hopefully back off can do a better job. Okay, so first of all, some refutation. So the first point they talk about is the role of education, that the school should be an agent of socialization, and that doesn't prepare students properly for the real world in which they will be criticized horrendously. I think the easy response to this, Madam Speaker, is that if this is what the real world is like, then we actually just reject this world. I think it's probably pretty terrible. We ought to be protecting these individuals if they need to. That's just a basic tenet of free speech. We understand that there are limitations on what people are able to and to not say. No thanks. Second thing they say is they start to talk about, like, media attention, and this is where they start to assert that more media attention is going to bring about, like, better results, okay? 2 responses. First of all, we just straight up don't buy into the fact that, into opposition's idea, that media coverage is always going to be better. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But second of all, if the New York Times and Washington Post, like, can't get enough accurate information, like, they just won't report on it, right? I think it's hard to pitch an idea to an editor when you don't have enough quotes or enough facts behind your story. And guess what? We're probably pretty freaking okay with this in some cases. I think it's okay that the media isn't reporting on all protests all of the time. There are specific ones that require certain special protections. I'll talk about that later. I'll take you at the end of my refutation. Another thing that they say, this is what Aislinn starts to talk about, the importance of having a space. 2 points of refutation. First of all, this is hugely reliant on the idea that any sort of resolution comes about, right? We don't actually hear how we're able to get some sort of mediating space between the university admin and the student leaders. But second of all, I don't know why you have to be a high-profile public individual outside of the university to actually achieve the change that you want. Again, we don't hear that either. The last thing I want to talk about is just, like, the model quibbles and concerns that they have about referenda. I think that this is reliant on the fact that, like, all sorts of non-interested people in the university are going to want to vote and get involved, right? First of all, like, I don't know about you, but, like, university students are pretty friggin' lazy, so I think that only the most motivated are actually going to want to go out to vote to this, right? I think, moreover, opposition ignores the fact the student leadership is, like, who are going to be requesting this from the university are probably going to be aware of the political landscape within the university and know whether or not that's a good idea. Also, like, we're just not eliminating protests altogether, right? Like, you're still able to have protests. The question is whether or not media coverage is actually going to come about. Sure.
Would you protect the right for the people who are being protested at or the institution to be able to defend itself in media? Because if so, then you're going to have a pretty shoddy way of having asymmetry of media coverage on that.
So I don't think that's what's going to happen, right? I think that the media coverage that's being protected is protecting all kinds of coverage over this kinds of protests. Okay, so first point of extension. What protests are most impacted and what they end up looking like. Madam Speaker, as I brought up in the middle of my speech, not all protests are going to have the same purpose, and they're not going to all cover the same things, right? So some protests, like the protests during the Vietnam War, want broad attention, right? They want to bring in outside media to achieve broad change. But I think that others don't. As Brent brings to in a POI, there are like sexual assault protests that criticize university administration for policies surrounding how they treat assault victims and things like that, and the justice policies within that. Why might some of these groups like these not want these protections? But as Speaker, not everyone actually wants to be the public face of a social movement beyond their university, right? They're having to come out of their shells, probably be a little bit of uncomfortable, and like, for example, having to speak about rape experiences or things like that. And I think this desire of privacy ought not invalidate your concerns and ability to change your university's policies, right? You might not want to speak out against it to broad public, but I think that you should have an ability to still lobby your university to change things that have hurt you in the past, right? So for example, at the University of Wisconsin, 17 women chained themselves to the dean's office, right? Like their faces and the focus on their names weren't shown. We don't understand why you need to know the exact identities and all the underlying details behind this in order to get the change that they need. I think there are a few impacts. Actually, well, there's one main impact and two sub-impacts. The main one, I think, is the problem is that there's a chilling effect that happens when you're not able to get the kinds of protests that you want, or you limit future protests. How? Two ways. First of all, I think that people are just going to be less willing to criticize their institutions when they're uncomfortable in the situation that they are in and the situation that the media is putting them in, right? No one's going to want to speak out, so quite simply, the policies at universities are simply not going to change when people aren't willing to talk and protest against it. Second of all, and more importantly, people are going to be less likely to join your movement right now, right? People are going to fear being outed and having their names spewed all over the news, perhaps, as I'll show you in a second, like having their, basically being defamed, fear of how the media will portray you, but moreover, even if that's not true, your interactions with your peers and your professors and your TAs that may disagree with you, I think are going to get significantly worse when you get more attention on that front. No thanks. Two, how do we actually get better outcomes? I think this is something severely lacking on opposition's side. But as Speaker, what we would tell you is that media actually blocks any progress that you can get to achieve the change that you want to see. I think firstly, admin is probably if admin is probably willing to protect protesters, it shows a willingness for them to cooperate, right? So I think that on one front is able to lower tensions. But more than that, we think that media actually heightens tensions more. How? Two ways. First of all, I think that often media wants to take sound bites and like throw them out of context, right? Because like the media wants something juicy, they're probably going to use those kinds of quotes. So for example, at the University of Missouri, a football player was asked if his record was 9-0, if he would still protest, and among other things that he said, a short answer he said was no, right? I think this is especially bad because people become distracted from the meaning behind the original protest and become focused on the kinds of things and the sound bites that are skewing the actual discussion that happens, right? I think the second reason of why this is so bad and how it heightens tensions is that you're starting to bring in outside forces, right? So men's right activists beyond the university are now able to critique rape victims, moreover get a bigger platform for the kinds of terrible things that they're saying. A few impacts. Opening government, I think, talks about radicalization, but I don't think they talk about how it impacts the specific kinds of progress and the mechanisms for achieving that we're able to get. Two ways I think that we are able to benefit this. First of all, I think that media entrenches people more, right, because you get a more fueled rhetoric, right? So for example, when it comes to race issues and it becomes a heightened media issue, I think that the university is going to be portrayed as racist, while the leftists the students as like leftist babies that can't take a joke or something, right? I think as a result you get less resolution when they are pitted against one another. But second of all, collective negotiation is harmed, right? Because it makes bargaining groups way less palatable on one hand, or it undermines them, right? Because the media will like interview different protesters who may demand different things because they don't have a coalesced group. I think as a result, you harm the ability for groups to be able to get the bargaining that they want. Very proud to impose.
Great, thank the member of government for that speech and call upon the member of opposition. Here.
We've heard a lot of weird assertions out of side government about what media coverage always looks like. I think that this is premised on two mistakes. First is that all media coverage is uniform and responsive to one particular kind of dynamic. That dynamic certainly exists, but lots and lots of others do, and I'm going to talk to you about that and what this media coverage might look like, while we get lots of different views on things that are controversial, hence the controversy. But second of all, I think we have a weird misunderstanding of what a protest is, because if indeed, as the only thing BackGov has to stand on, you are someone whose privacy rights are very important to you, who might feel personally victimized by putting yourself out there in the public debate, don't fucking protest. The point of a protest is that it is public and demonstrative, provocative. I think that is generally the mechanism that it uses to message to the public consciousness. There are a lot of other and better ways that if you are, for example, a victim of sexual assault, you can try to advocate for policy change. This might involve direct contact with the university administration. This might involve private meetings. This might involve lobbying through the student government. This might involve having someone who's not you lead this protest. But I don't think that protests have the right to, maintain total control over how they are defined in the public. I think by being a public act, they contribute to a public discussion, and in that sense should absolutely be subject to public scrutiny and public debate. I have several points of extension for you. The first is about media coverage, the second is about the university and the roles of protest. So media coverage, not uniform, not always possible to predict A, what it will look like, or B, what its effects will be, particularly when we're talking about protests that are largely irrational, have a lot to do with social momentum that behaves in ways that are unpredictable. So there is simply no way of knowing in advance which, for example, police shooting in the US is going to become the one that gets a lot of momentum in the media and becomes a sort of an impetus for political change. Similarly, there is no way of predicting in advance how the Occupy movement was going to be interpreted, and I would like to point out that it was interpreted in several different ways by several different media outlets. There was no way of knowing that it would achieve the kind of momentum that it did. So protests are in fact unpredictable in the ways that they are covered by media, and you cannot simply fiat in they're always covered in a particular way. There are also liberal media outlets. There are also in-depth media outlets like the New York Times or like Fox. I think those are often things that we do want to have access to these protests, especially given the existence of social media that I'll talk about later. But I don't think the media just ignores these. I think we simply don't have them having better access and better information, and that's bad. No, I'll take you later. So you can't fiat in what this coverage will look like in the way that First Gov wants to do. Even if you could, that doesn't give you a good reason to infringe on the First Amendment rights of media and of freedom of the press to cover things that are public demonstrations and contributions to public dialogue. I think that perhaps legally, private institutions do have the ability to do this because universities should stand for intellectual freedom, and because I'm going to tell you about why this is a particularly important kind of intellectual freedom for them to be facilitating, I think they should choose to stand for this, and they should choose to allow the media in their private spaces as they are mandated to in public spaces. I think that distinction is a bit of a silly one. Next, what is the university and its interests, and what is the particular role of protest in this? These debates about, I think we're largely talking about instances of racism at Missouri, at Yale, and at Harvard. We're not largely talking about sexual assault in this case, although I think it applies here. But these debates about intellectual freedom and the way that that interacts with recognizing structural oppression and the histories of structural oppression, particularly in how that plays out in the classroom, are tremendously important right now. They are complicated and contentious. They're very important for the identity going forward of what higher education institutions with a history of oppression, but a future, hopefully, of intellectual freedom look like. They're very important for universities conceiving of themselves and for students conceiving of their role in educational institutions. So there are several reasons why we need this conversation in particular to occur, where open dialogue is facilitated and where coverage is facilitated. It is because, okay, I think it's important that when things like oppression and racism exist, we do need safe spaces for people to talk about their experiences and to be able to express those without feeling that they're victimized or they're subject to dissent or public scrutiny. A protest, unfortunately, is not the right place to be looking for a safe space. If you're looking for a safe space, go somewhere else that is purposely for that. I think a protest is for putting your views out there into the public dialogue and representing them as best as possible. So a public demonstration is performative. It is a contribution to a public discussion, but it's tremendously important, and this is not the right place to be looking for a safe space. So why is the media particularly important, though, in this particularly important discussion? One, because I just think there is a principle to defend in having this discussion about intellectual freedom in an intellectually free way that the university can look at and be proud of in terms of procedural justice. It can say, we have heard the different views on this complex issue. We have publicly deliberated based on the members of our institution. We've come to a decision or are continuing to think about our decisions with respect to this. I think that is why free speech in terms of this kind of dialogue is especially important. But second of all, there is an issue of historical record. We're talking about explicitly racist incidents in Missouri and the response of the administration, or whether we are talking about renaming Calhoun Hall at Yale. I think it's important that this is part of the legacy and identity of the university. There needs to be some accountability and record of how these decisions were come to, how and why these decisions were made. I think that is an important point of reference going forward for what the identity of the university is and how it deals with these controversial and complex issues that do have a lot of personal effects for people. So I think we need to make these accessible to people who just weren't physically at the protests in order for them to understand these issues, but also accessible for students in the future and other stakeholders in the future to understand these dynamics. Second of all, though, let's talk about consequences. So on the comparative, what happens on either side? Okay, first of all, media coverage does not go away necessarily, right? So I think that we heard one reason out of Katrina why the media might not cover stuff when they don't have enough information. Please recognize, if you buy FrontGov's analysis that the media sucks so much and is going to pay so little attention to what the facts are in this situation, they might indeed still cover stuff about which they don't have a lot of information. But second of all, these things have other ways of becoming important in the public discussion, given that social media still exists. I think it was particularly pernicious. For example, at Colgate, when the scandal was about racist incidents on Yik Yak, there is very little control over how those are interpreted in social media. It can spiral out of control and still become a big enough issue for mainstream media outlets to talk about. I think it's better that they have direct access to what's happening in the protest so that the conversation is not then co-opted by the college, who becomes the only actor to speak on it. So if they want to say, no, all of these protesters are crazy radicals, we should definitely ignore them, the media doesn't have access to the protesters, or as Front App told you, doesn't have access to most of the moderate protesters in order to counter that narrative. It's better that we have more official access of more official and accountable media institutions that are not the social media to people who have like at least some stake in creating moderate conversation within the public sphere. So I think information and access is always consequentially better. Second of all, does this change the dynamics within the protest? I think sometimes the presence of the media may. We heard a concern out of Mo about this, that it might cause fewer students to protest. Okay, whatever, but I think these students will be put off by public scrutiny of a public demonstration, or not necessarily the students we need contributing to this conversation anyway. I don't think there are that many of them, and I don't think they're necessarily the voices we need. They don't have a right to be protected in that sense. But I think that they do now exert some direct control over the representation, and they're speaking directly and representing themselves directly to the mainstream media outlets that are paying attention to them anyway, if this is indeed consequential. So I think it's not a safe space from dissent or from record, and you should not behave as if it is, and that changes the way you behave in the protest by having that knowledge presented to you, then fine, that's okay. It's something we're willing to eat. Out of like first government, I think I've defended quite clearly why we do need this as not a safe space, but rather an issue of public debate. Out of second government, they want to stand on a ridiculously narrow conception of this, where the interests of these people are probably not to protest in the first place, but to engage in some other sort of advocacy. I think a protest is always performative, not always be recorded, subject to free speech. We're very proud to of this.
Great, I thank the member of opposition for that speech and now call upon the government whip. Here.
There are lots of good alternatives for people who were sexually assaulted to go to if they want to get their administration to listen to them. They can lobby that administration, they can write reports, they can file complaints. The problem for Julia Squared in this round is what happens to those individuals when they are protesting about the fucking processes that never actually work, right? That's what happens in a lot of the cases with racism and sexual assault, is that insofar as their glib response to our extension is don't fucking protest, if the processes aren't good in the first place, they get no efficacy for the people that are being affected by these types of problems, and that means that Julia's glib response is absolutely inadequate to dealing with this round. I'm sure that Milden will have all the responses to our case, probably a problem for their team insofar all the engagement is happening from one speaker, not just from front half, but all, like not from back half, but also from front half. Big problem for their team. Okay, so what are the themes in this debate? First theme, what's best for the students themselves and whether we should prioritize them over media. And second theme, conflict resolution and how the media complicates this. Note that the only team in this round that gives you any analysis as to how we get better conflict resolution between universities and students is us, right? No other team even tries to take on the burden of saying that better solutions will become formed, besides second opposition saying we need some accountability and record of what happens. That is less important than actually reaching some type of resolution to the problems at hand, and unless they can give you reasons why this is going to be better for them, I think they're going to fail in this debate. But let's start with the theme of why this is what's best for students and whether should we prioritize them over media, right? So first government in this round tells us that students have ownership over their private universities and deserve safe spaces. I think Katrina gives you some specific instances and why this is important. And yeah, we do talk about sexual assault because it's an example, right? And you guys talk a lot about racism. That doesn't mean that our arguments are only applicable to cases of sexual assault. Racism is also often sometimes something people don't feel super comfortable talking about in front of the fucking media, right? In a lot of these instances, you might want to go to your university, show that there's a huge collective amount of people that care about this problem, and that there's collective action that's going to be taken against them without being shown on a newspaper or another instance like that. The only response that we get to this is from front half, weird because they didn't even have the chance to respond to our arguments, is that we can just basically redact their names in the media, right? So 2 responses to that. First of all, this does not happen in all media organizations. At best, they get this in some of the media organizations. But second of all, oftentimes it's pretty obvious which students are being talked about. When you are the person who was raped by the Missouri quarterback, it's not very difficult when that person wants to start shaming you to make you a public figure, okay? So they can't just basically get rid of all these harms by talking about redacted names, especially when the newspapers themselves often don't actually do it because they aren't really concerned about the interests of that person, their interest about the story. But what's most important here? We talk about a chilling effect. Why this ends up becoming a huge problem. Because when you only leave these mechanisms of lobbying your lobbying your administration through things like sending letters or for making a formal complaint, and that doesn't work, then these people never end up actually being at the protests. I'd say that you people make the logical conclusion, I don't feel comfortable being in this instance and having to share this experience with hundreds of thousands of people over the world, so I'm just never going to actually bring these problems up. That's bad both because these voices are never heard and because what the voices say is never heard, okay? So we don't get the type of robust discourse that second opposition and first opposition want so much in this round. It's all reliant on the people who are willing to be in public. Like, great, the white Northwestern quarterback who wants collective action and the unionization of, like, football players might be willing to go up in front of everyone and say that, but that doesn't apply to everyone. Opposition in this round needs to tell you why people who aren't willing to go in public are less important and should be not allowed to protest in specific instances. I'll take front half and back half later. Go ahead.
Okay, so these protests are just going to move away from that center. So all the same things happen and people are more likely to listen to the protest that is covered in the media. Why is this okay on private institutions, but public institutions are free range? Okay,
few responses. First of all, there's not often like counter-protests happening at the same time. Generally speaking, when protests happen, the leaders of those organizations make a decision. They make it based on what they think is within the best interests of their own members and in terms of conflict resolution. So I don't think it moves away from that space at all. I don't think that's ever proven by them. And also, there are going to be instances, as Katrina points out at the beginning of her speech, in which people realistically decide media attention is going to be much better for us, so we should allow it to happen. But at least on our side of the house, those public spaces are available in some instances where they are important. They don't get that on their side of the house. Okay, what else do we get in terms of this round, in terms of talking about conflict resolution and how the media complicates this, right? So we get some arguments about the media from the second half especially, talking about how media isn't all uniform, it's not all terrible, like pretty obvious stuff about how some is good and some is bad. But I'd suggest to you that if you're uncomfortable sharing your experience, it doesn't really matter which of the media organizations it is, right? For a few reasons. First of all, because talking about it in general is what the harmful thing is, and second of all, because all of those organizations are going to be present. So that's the problem in terms of talking about how this might impact you specifically. And insofar as how it affects radicalization, the issue is that the most predominant news organizations and the ones that people pay most attention to are the ones that are polarized, right? So MSNBC and Fox News. They end up shaping the discourse over a lot of what happens in places like Missouri when all of a sudden, as Katrina said, the administration becomes racist and the other people become lazy brats who can't take a joke, that type of thing. That's why these things end up becoming harder to evaluate. Sure, even though you guys didn't take anyone else. Go ahead.
Insofar as you lose the benefit of free intellectual dialogue, your only benefit is that the university is pressured to listen to these protesters. You lose all of that sway when no one is paying attention.
Okay, what's the benefit of intellectual dialogue insofar as the benefits that we give you on our side of the house are universities having to adapt and change their structures and listen in ways that make it better for students to live in those universities, better for students to be able to complain, and better for students to get action so that their communities represent them. I think that's a comparative that's pretty easy for us to win, and I'm glad to stand on it. Okay, what else is important in terms of conflict resolution and how the media ends up complicating this necessarily? We get the idea, right, that there's all these practical harms, largely from first off, that necessarily accrue insofar as we don't know who the protesters are, like how are they going to vote, how are all these things necessarily going to occur? And I think that this is like Robert Embry would be proud if he were here now, but I don't think that necessarily just nitpicking this principle is a good way to win this debate, right? Different organizations will do this in different ways, as First Government, I think, tells you. And the reason that it ends up becoming relevant is because in certain situations, no one is going to go to the organization that they want nothing to do with and vote to kind of stifle them, right? It's also not going to stop the protests from happening in the first place. No protest will be stopped. It's just a difference about whether or not it'll have public attention. So at best, that argument on side first opposition means that we don't get as much of what we advocate for, but at least we get some of it, okay? That's really important. At the end of this round, two things to consider that I think are really important. Why is it that we are prioritizing the nebulous idea of freedom of speech over the actual harms that can occur to students when they are harmed by their universities, the media themselves, and who gets better conflict resolution? I think it's clear that second government wins both those questions. We are proud.
Great, thank the government for that speech and call upon the opposition to close the debate. Here, here.
I think Julia gave you the most accurate conception of the round when she told you that safe spaces are not equal to student protests, and that as a student, you should never have the right to public speech without the same check of public record. Furthermore, I think it was obvious when First Opposition told us that they assumed it is the interest of minority students to be covered, and the risk is the repression of majority vote. Instead, it's not just this. It's actually when students don't want coverage and why they shouldn't be allowed that right to say when and when not the media should check them and offer them support. Julia tells you why it harms the university interest when there is no media there, when it actually locks out support, given that the media is often what grants and galvanized protests, gives them legitimacy, is a tool for these protests to spread to other universities and invite other people to join, and moreover, doesn't actually allow public access. So what I'm going to talk to you about is why, first of all, the principle of free speech. This was shockingly not debated about, except by Julia, given that the topic of the First Amendment was listed in the resolution itself. I think that's something you should take note of. And then secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the practical effects on the protests and the students themselves. So, I think this issue about free speech by both parties. Front Op tells us that, look, it's going to be often co-opted in terms of who gets the cycle because of the 24-hour news cycle, etc., etc. I think that this doesn't mean that we can violate First Amendment rights to be there simply because the media doesn't always act in the way they want them. I think this also deals a lot with what side opposition or the backgov tells us when they say, look, sometimes the media acts in shitty ways. They use sound bites, they use entrenched rhetoric. We gave you a lot of reasons as to why problems with the media doesn't mean that we simply don't think they should exist at all or should ever have a right to that free speech existing. The answer isn't to shut out views in coverage, Honorable Speaker. The answer in terms of when there is debate about what this discourse is and what it means, to allow the vast plurality of views to be able to tell you where and how that may indeed be important. No, thank you. So when Julia tells you that this media coverage, you cannot predict which will be picked up and how they will be picked up, and moreover that these problems with media never were proven why you should be able to violate their First Amendment right, I think that's universally important. But then she tells you that the practical impact of free speech is indeed in the university interest, insofar as they protect intellectual freedom and want to discuss structural oppression when these institutions are renegotiating their role and their identity based off of issues of racism and structure. I think it is entirely in their interest that they make that debate as open and visible and transparent as possible, not only as a role of an educative institution, but also in terms of a safe place for public deliberation and free speech. Because I think the conflation that was made by Front Op is that this needs to be a safe space. Julia tells you that it is not necessarily about having a safe space, right? Because locking out observation by media is not the same thing as locking out dissent within a classroom where you say what kind of terminology may or may not be used. If you want to have those kinds of discussions, by all means, go into a safe space. But we accept that the nature of protest is to galvanize interest and to have that mass protest that actually can initiate some kind of change. She told you about issues of historical record, legacy, and accountability. Those were never contended with and are hugely important. Share Front Half, then back up later.
Okay, so please let me finish. We told you that students want to create a safe space where they can have dialogue and educate non-involved members without being attacked or misrepresented, particularly when you attend private institutions that are already stigmatized. When First Amendment protections don't exist, why would self-interested administrations be more likely to protect those interests rather than students' groups themselves?
Okay. The way that I think we respond to that question is in saying oftentimes the student administration doesn't care, right? That's why these people are protesting. So when you look at issues of Colgate and racism, the only reason that people cared was because the media was allowed to pick up on that and supported them. So I think the huge thing that they don't understand in this round is oftentimes it is the media who offers support to black students who who are protesting, or it is the media who offers support to people who need that kind of support. That's going to refute right now the extension that we got when they say, look, you need to protect people's identity and the media heightens tension. I think the whole point of the idea is that it's public and demonstrative. So they think that that response from Julie is flippant, but I think also you need this kind of coverage for protests of this kind to work. So insofar, 3 responses to this. First of all, in terms of the coverage, I think it stands often for the rights of minorities and collectivizes national support. So the media was one of the reasons why the recent protests at UCT about fees must fall was so successful, because they could galvanize public support around a public issue of a failure of governance. Without the media, that would not have happened, and it was entirely in the university's interest to be able to shut that down. They shouldn't have been able to do that. I think also, though, is that it is the media that initiates and expands these protests to other venues that is so important. But secondly, I don't understand why if somebody chooses a protest as a form of statement, as opposed to other mechanisms that were available to them, why they would never want media coverage unless they thought that media coverage was going to support people that were not in support of them. So when you have things like sexual assault, like the girl who carried her mattress around until the university acceded to her demands that they reform sexual assault policy, or when in fact women chained themselves to the door of the dean's office, those actions have no meaning outside of public representation within the media. I think that's crucially important. Sure, I'll take back half now before time runs out.
Sure. So if students should just not protest because they're too weak, what methods of recourse do you have if university processes are not conducive to dealing with disputes properly?
We're not saying that students should never protest. Students should protest if they feel that the protest is the best mechanism for them to reach out and say that. But the issue is that Julie and I tell you is that if you want a venue for public speech, you ought to be subject to the recourse of having that public speech be noted and be part of historical record and be part of public debate. I don't think you get a public space for debate that is also private and insular where nobody can respond to you. That isn't a public space. Julia also told you why. You can't simply caveat out that these are private institutions, so laws around public spaces don't apply to them. Even if you are within a private space, so to speak, which is not Front Op's conception of that people pay the money, it's a historical difference as to why these universities exist, that should still happen. So moreover, I think that Front Hop entirely mischaracterizes with their model when they don't understand how protests actually progress, how Julia told you, how they can lose momentum, etc., when you have these debates about whether or not they should be covered, when you need to be aggregate over specific organizers. I think that for all of these reasons, but most especially the information that Julia gives you, how the alternatives, including social media, are so awful because they aren't direct access, they aren't official, and they aren't accountable, and to why if you were to access a public space, you ought to make that a part of public record. You're incredibly proud.
Great, thank all the teams for that debate. We've got to head out now.